My name is Isabella Trent. I used to believe that love was a compass you could follow without question, until the compass split in two, and one of the halves was a lie. If you're here because you want a story where the breakup is the end, this isn't it. This is a story where the breakup is the beginning of something cold and careful. This is a story about betrayal that required engineering. This is about quiet revenge, clean and deliberate, and about building a life that no one could bulldoze again. This is Revenge Stories with Michelle. If this story touches you, if you recognize the quiet theft of your life inside it, give it a like, subscribe, and tell me where you're listening from. Your voice matters. Your ending matters. I met him in a moment that felt like a cut in a movie. Bright, cinematic, both of us cast in the same light. His name was Ethan Cole, and his smile fit the kind of ad I used to write. Polished, confident, with an edge I mistook for bravery. He worked a few blocks away in an agency he called a boutique, and I worked for a tech company that paid me well and asked me more than I thought it deserved. I had learned to wrap myself in lists and deliverables. It felt safer than leaving my heart unplanned. Ethan was not dramatic. He did not arrive with fireworks or sweeping gestures. He arrived like a puzzle piece that slid perfectly into a space I had thought empty by design. He remembered the name of my favorite font, the scent of the candle I used to center myself, the exact title of a book I'd read years ago and never told anyone about. He made small, precise gestures that carried weight. A letter under my door after my father's funeral, a coffee at my desk when I had deadlines stacked like bricks. It felt like care. It felt like partnership. It felt, almost immediately, like the easiest kind of forever. Within 6 months, he had a key. Within 9 months, I signed a partnership agreement with Cole and Gray. Gray was the name he wanted the agency to have. He said it sounded professional, modern, like a brand that could scale. I laughed at him at first, but he was strategic in a way that made strategy look like romance. He floated the idea. I helped finalize the terms, down to who would manage invoices, who would own the domain, who would sit where during client calls. He told me I was indispensable. He told me I was the backbone. When you are in love with someone who praises your competence, generosity becomes a compliment you can't refuse. When he said, "I don't know what I'd do without you," I signed forms and scanned receipts and coded late invoices and created pitches. I wired money from my account to his, when his payroll stretched thinner than his promises. I let my professional caution dissolve into a loyalty I hadn't even recognized as insecurity. The first red flag was a slip, and it was small. A blank space at the edges of our life where my name should have been. A photographer was credited as a co-founder on a client press release. "Oh," he said when I pointed it out, "Vanessa helps with imagery. We brand as a team." Vanessa. I met her twice. She had a smile that fit pictures when men stood behind cameras. She knew lighting and the right angle to make brands look sacred. She also had a last name that, in a calculation that tasted like betrayal, he placed next to his. "Branding," he said. "It's public facing. Names matter." "Names matter to honesty too," I said. He smiled with the practiced pity someone uses to quiet inconvenient anger. "You signed a partnership document, Bella. It's complicated to change that now." The word complicated was always his favorite when he wanted to move blame from his hands to a neutral idea. People who manipulate turn a word into a dam. You run into water, and it's navy blue and still, and then the dam breaks and you're under. I tried to be reasonable. I tried to speak without heat. I asked for transparency, for the smallest of public acknowledgments that our work was joint. He gave me answers sitting in the middle distance, like someone offering a lounge chair rather than a home. I remember that night because the moon in his apartment looked like a coin's face. He poured me whiskey at the kitchen island and said casually, "You always see betrayal where it isn't." I walked out with my coat and a pocket full of receipts. I slept on the couch of a friend who left a plate and a blanket and did not ask for the story. The truth of betrayal is that it arrives in small, precise cuts. It steals currency in the quiet moments when you are still trying to be generous. For a while, I did what a lot of women do. I compensated. I worked harder at my day job, at his business, at everything around the fissure. I thought proof would serve as an adhesive. I paid invoices he had promised to settle. I wrote proposals in the middle of the night, confident my competence would bring fairness. I refused selfishly to believe that someone I had loved could be building legitimate things on the currency of lies. It was another slip that made me look deeper. I was cleaning up files he'd left open on his laptop, client drafts sitting on the desktop, invoices half sent, images named in shorthand the way people do when they trust disorganization. I found the books, misfiled expenses, a series of personal charges coded as client-related, bank transfers I did not recognize. He'd been creative with miscellaneous for months. That day, the room acquitted itself of any romance. The light through his blinds shaped clear lines on the floor. I sat at his kitchen table and counted numbers until the digits blurred. $42,000, 56, 100,000. The amounts felt like a number of knives. I found text messages where he asked me to advance this because the client is slow to pay. I found voicemails from a man with an urgent tone I had never heard in his voice, with the word loan, used like a verb I started to document. I created a file called For Me, and I dragged everything into it: receipts, screenshots, invoices, messages, times and dates, and contextual notes like a detective gathering pattern. It felt obscene at first, like hoarding evidence of a love that had believed itself to be healing. But the healthy part of me, the same part that had built a career from scratch, recognized the principle. Currency needs recording. It is one thing to be betrayed, and another to be surprised by the betrayal again and again. The surprise is the trap. It keeps you off balance. So I stopped being surprised. I began acting as if I had already known the worst and only sought tools. I created spreadsheets, legal notes, copies of everything. I opened new bank accounts in my name that he could not access. I consulted a lawyer whose office smelled faintly of old coffee and competence. I began to plan not for drama, but for architecture. Revenge, when you make it an art, is less about spectacle and more about structure. If you want to take something down, start by understanding the foundation. Where are the cracks? What's the flow of money, of influence, of reputation? Who reads the newsletters? Who sits on the jury? Who types the articles that clients read? Who writes the check that keeps a company alive? Ethan's brand was cultivated on its public image: polished case studies, cinematic photography, Instagram artful ambiguity, the kind of content that promised intention and luxury. It was projecting a past that had not always been true. That public image was brittle because it was built on small, invisible thefts and unrecorded favors. If I carefully exposed the mechanics, the misallocated invoices, the personal charges tucked as service fees, the client promises he had taken as lines of credit, the public perception could change fast. Reputation is a currency that devalues quicker than you think. If you apply thermal shock, I decided to apply measured heat. The first move was mundane and bureaucratic. I contacted vendors. I asked for copies of invoices. I asked questions about projects with names that I knew were linked to us. I was polite. Politeness disarms. People tend to open doors if asked the right way. In the answers I received, small inconsistencies began to appear. One vendor reported an unpaid balance we'd paid. Another reported an invoice that matched a personal charge on his card. Little things, tiny knots. But knots, when tugged, unravel. I also spoke to the friend who managed a local PR list. I did it not with vengeance in my voice, but with professional curiosity. I'd like to do a feature on sustainable branding, I said. Also, there's this trend of transparency. Could you check something for me? I was careful with wording. The PR friend asked for proof. I gave none. I asked for a conversation. People who work in public relations love a pattern. When a story breathes consistency, they lean toward it. While I pulled public threads, I quietly secured the legal anchoring of my life. I moved bank lines. I withdrew money he thought was still in our joint accounts. I placed small holds. I created separate logs of every time he asked me to advance funds. I prepared a clean, legally sound dossier that would show his business decisions, not mine, as the source of any subsequent downfall. He noticed, of course. The first time he confronted me, he leaned against the exposed brick in his studio-turned-home and called my meticulousness neurotic. He said I was making mountains from molehills. When you are being gaslit, the language is always an insult of inevitability. You are too much. You are too emotional. You don't understand business. He had a talent for making my defense sound like hysteria, but he could not deny numbers. One afternoon, he sat at the kitchen island and for once did not try to charm. "What are you doing with the invoices?" he asked. The question was sterile, but his eyes were bright with panic. "Recording," I said, "and making sure the books are correct." He laughed, a thin sound. "This is why you always thought you were in charge." "You asked me to help," I said. The truth sounded like a verdict. Over the next few weeks, I wielded transparency like a scalpel. I assembled the files in a manner any auditor could follow. I opened an LLC under Trent Studio and registered the domain. I set forwarders and redirects to empty addresses, so if someone attempted to search for Cole and Gray's works, they'd land on evidence that 4 of the 6 successful launches had overdue invoices. I sent a carefully worded note to one of our largest clients, asking if they were happy with recent work. I attached a draft contract for a pro bono audit because the client had once bragged about their attention to sustainability and ethical accounting. What I did not do was go screaming into public. I did not send a venomous email to every newsletter. I did not call him by name in a public space. There was a reason. Rage is a loud currency, and it often pays back with collateral damage to the one who spends it. I wanted a ruin that held the man accountable, not a spectacle that made me smaller as a result. So I worked through channels that had teeth. I forwarded vendor invoices to our investor with a short professional note. I copied the IRS tip line, not emotionally, but with fact-based documentation. Transfers, misallocated charges, potential tax irregularities. I sent an anonymous note, not maliciously but factually, to a trade publication we'd once dreamed of being in. The publication asked for evidence, and I gave them clean, factual documents, redacted where necessary but pointed. The journalist who wrote the first piece preferred facts to fury. She liked narratives with receipts. I watched reputations shift, not instantly. Disasters in a brand often arrive like bad weather, slow and undeniable. First, there was a denial. The investor asked for clarification. Then there was distance clients who had enjoyed the curated ambiguity of Cole, and Gray's work wanted clarity and not drama. They requested audits. They delayed payments. They withheld new projects. The lender we used quietly posted notices about overdue accounts. Contracts that once slid across tables with smiles now required signatures and third-party verification. Ethan panicked in a way I hadn't expected. He walked around in the morning with the blankness of someone who had miscounted his life. I continued my quiet work, and his public persona eroded in the exact ways that would matter to him. Calls from clients that rang cold, investors requesting meetings that ended with a polite, "We're pausing." Vanessa, who'd smiled in glossy photos, unfollowed him and then left for a local art residency, signaling that she had options. Rumors coalesced into a pattern newspapers liked: mismanagement, questionable billing practices, claims of personal spending under company expense codes. It was methodical. It hurt. But it was clean. There were nights I did not sleep. There were afternoons when the weight of the plan pressed against my ribs like a fist. I felt moments of moral vertigo, the dizzying sensation that comes when you weaponize competence. People asked if I felt guilty. My answer was always honest, but then I felt righteous relief I had given him chance after chance. I had used kindness like a bandage. When kindness is treated like a bank, it needs to be closed. The final collapse was anticlimactic in the way of all real-world disasters: legal letters and a silent office. The investor called for a forensic audit, and the audit, in its sober clarity, did not sugarcoat errors. He lost clients like a table loses legs. Contracts evaporated. A marquee client pulled a launch, citing financial concerns, and his accounts were frozen. A bank placed a lien, and the agency that had once been his entire identity, the brand with articles and case studies, and the kind of photography that made startups look like they could save the planet, turned into a legal problem. When the repo men took their first round of leased equipment, he sat on a crate and did not yell. He looked like someone who had been unmade. He showed up at my apartment the night the final client left. Shirt wrinkled, eyes hollow. He knocked at my door the way he used to tap messages into my phone. For a moment, I allowed an old humanity to trickle through. He was a man who had lost something he had built on borrowed empathy. He said, "I don't understand how it got like this." "Neither did you when you started it," I said. He demanded apology. He accused me of betrayal. "You could have spoken sooner," he said. "You could have told me what you were doing." "You could have chosen not to lie," I replied. We sat in the silence that comes when an old narrative ends and no new one is ready. He left. He kept trying for some months: voicemail, texts, a strange email asking for coffee to talk. With the kind of earnestness predators misuse as penance, I filed everything. I preserved messages. When he tried to sue, as men do when they cannot face their own choices, his case was hollow because the paper trail I'd compiled showed his mismanagement, and his misdeeds law cares about receipts. It is not poetic. I was not cruel. I never doctored documents. I did not invent stories to damage him behind a smokescreen. Truth, well arranged and undeniable, did the work. There is no sensation like watching someone face the consequence of their own shape. Once the audits were public, and once the journalist who had asked for documentation published an even-handed piece that laid out the facts, word moved fast, and my industry colleagues I had not spoken with sent me messages. Some were cautious. Most were relieved. The relief was not for my drama, but for clarity. People want the moral equilibrium of work to make sense. In the aftermath, I did things that felt small and sacred. I closed the joint accounts and arranged for the transfer of any client we had responsibly taken care of to individuals who could actually serve them. I called every vendor and apologized for any confusion the partnership had caused. I sat with a few clients and listened. I did not bury my hands in celebration. Instead, I knelt in practical tasks: invoices, a press release that read like a textbook, and meetings where I explained steps being taken to make sure no one else would be left in a lurch. The revenge had cost me. It was not free. It required time I could not bill, nights I could not sleep, and a grind that left the taste of metal in my mouth. But it reclaimed something immense, my identity as someone who would not allow her work to be monetized against her. I regained reputation and, more importantly, integrity. There is a currency beyond money. It is the ability to stand in your own name and not have to apologize for being true months turned into a year. The fractures of the old life healed into new forms. I had built Trent Studio with clean books, transparent contracts, and clients who showed up because they wanted integrity, not illusion. I took on pro bono work for a nonprofit that helped women manage finances after abusive partnerships. A project that felt like reclamation in miniature. I taught small workshops about financial boundaries and how to read a ledger without shame. Women and men came with stories of micro-betrayals and stolen paychecks and asked practical questions. How do I build a paper trail? How do I close joint accounts without losing my dignity? Some nights I still woke to phantom panic at the sound of a knock on the door. Old tensions have a geometry that does not fade quickly. But having seen a structure collapse and then rebuild with better engineering, I slept with a new kind of steadiness. I had planned the emergency exit and, more importantly, strengthened the doors. There was a final moment that folded the whole arc into a quiet closure. It was not a lawsuit victory or a viral post. It was a letter, small, typed, not even a full page. He had used a burner address and it arrived slipped in a prepaid envelope. The letter said simply, "I'm sorry, I lost everything I had to rebuild. If you ever want your money back, call." There was no guilt in the paper, only bureaucracy. I could have kept him on a hook, I suppose. Payment plans, legal reminders, a chance to make him pay in earnest. Maybe it would have felt righteous to force restitution. But justice in a court is not the same as justice for the heart. I signed the letter and placed it in a drawer I wrote briefly on a return postcard. You should not ask my peace to be a currency. I'd rather it remain mine. Then I burned a paper I had written years ago when he had first told me he could not be faithful, not in a physical fire, but in a ceremonial way. I deleted the message threads. I removed the photos of us from my feeds. I erased the backups that held the easy tenderness of the first months. It was not spite. It was choice. It felt like practical mercy for a person who had already been judged by consequences. After the ruin, life returned in the shape of small victories. I learned how to choose tasks that fit my energy instead of obligations that fit his ego. I dated in small ways. A coffee with someone who listened. A walk with a man who asked more questions than answers. A man named Miles, who did not prod for wounds, but sat quietly as I stitched things together. He was patient in a way that did not test my walls, but respected them. And in the slow process of two people building something careful, I found again the possibility of love. We dated without grand pronouncements. We had meals without drama. He met the true me, the woman who would never again mistake praise for permission to be consumed. Our relationship was not a rescue, it was an expansion. The last scene in the arc that matters to me was unremarkable and perfect. I stood at a product launch in a lighting lab with a team I had assembled at Trent Studio and watched a campaign my team had built play on a street wall at dusk. The image was simple: a woman smiling in a garden, buying seeds at a small stall. The caption read, "Roots Matter." People clapped. Clients sent short messages of congrats. My phone vibrated once, an ephemeral echo from a number I did not recognize. I did not answer. I cooked dinner with Miles and went to bed with the relief that comes from having built a life that operates on the same morals I do. In the years since, I've run into Ethan twice in real life. Once in a coffee shop where he sat with a stack of invoices and a face too tired to smile, and once at a mutual acquaintance's gallery opening where he hovered at the edges like someone learning how to be small. I did not speak in either case. He saw me in both. He understood, probably, that his ability to recover did not oblige me to be his mirror. There was no dramatic confrontation, because the drama had been resolved by work and consequence long before either of us needed to rehearse it. Revenge can be many things. It is not always a dramatic reveal or a shuttered door. Sometimes it is simply the decision to build a better building, where the walls are sound and the plumbing is honest. My revenge was to engineer a life that could not be taken from me. I teach that now. I tell other women and men to read the small print, to love with zeal but with a ledger in the background, to be generous but not transactional. I tell them to be builders of their own peace. First, I say that because I have walked through the kind of betrayal that should break you and found that you can map the ruin and use it to shape a stronger foundation. This is Revenge Stories with Michelle, a place where quiet courage and true endings find each other. If the story landed somewhere raw, please like and subscribe and tell me where you're listening from. Your story matters. Your ending matters. In the end, what I wanted most was never the dramatic destruction of a man's life, but the reclamation of mine. The best revenge was the life I built afterward. Honest clients, clear contracts, loyal friends, a brand that pays its vendors on time, a studio that funds scholarships for small business owners who have been exploited. The restitution came in the form of structure. And so I say this to anyone listening who's been used in the name of love. You do not have to shout to be heard. You can be precise. You can be methodical. You can be relentless in your care for yourself without losing kindness. You can let the law of consequence do its work while you rebuild. You can make a life that no one can commandeer again. Peace, true peace, is quieter than revenge and harder won than most things. It does not arrive on a stage. It arrives in the hours you spend cleaning the kitchen together, in the simple, repetitive acts of responsibility. It arrives when you no longer wake with panic at a knock. That is what I achieved. That is the last thing I wanted to hold up as a proof. Some people think revenge is loud. For me, it was quiet. It was architectural. It was the rebuilding of a life that had been misinterpreted as generosity and turned into a debt. If you want the blueprint, the practical steps I used to make sure I did not make the same mistakes again, I've made courses, workshops, and a short guide I send to people who sign up for my newsletter. But the essential lesson is not paperwork, it's posture. Stand in your name. Keep your receipts. Let kindness be a gift and not a deposit system. And when someone takes from you in the name of love, let the court of facts do what the heart cannot always do. Make consequences clear. We deserve endings that are honest and beginnings that are chosen. I tell that story until voices come back to me. I know now that I will be careful with my heart, but not afraid of it. The world is full of people who will test your boundaries. Self-respect is the work of a lifetime. When I think of that younger woman who signed a partnership because love felt like a business plan, I want to tell her 1,000 things, but mostly this: build the life you would be proud to inherit. Do not let someone else keep your title in their pocket. If love asks you to forfeit your autonomy, say no. If kindness is used as currency, withdraw. A year after everything ended, I stood at the edge of a small garden at a client's launch party. It was dusk and the lights were soft. Miles held my hand and squeezed it gently. I watched as our work played over a large screen, not a monument to destruction, but a tribute to clarity. Companies known for integrity I felt a kind of clean satisfaction that is not triumphant, it's restful. The weeks after the audit were a blur of precision. Every morning at 7, I sat at my desk with a mug of black coffee and watched my inbox fill with responses to the evidence I'd quietly distributed. Each reply was another crack in Ethan's empire. The investor wrote first, "Please clarify these discrepancies before the end of the quarter." Then the client, "We've suspended all deliverables pending clarification of accounting irregularities." Then the supplier, "Payment overdue 93 days. Final notice." Each message was polite, sterile, professional, but together they sounded like Judgment Day whispered in corporate tone. Ethan called me from 3 different numbers before I finally answered. His voice was no longer smooth. It was ragged. "What did you do?" he hissed. "Correction," I said. "What did you do?" "I'm just turning the lights on." "You think you're better than me?" "No," I said softly. "I think I'm free." 2 days later, I arrived at the Cole and Gray office to retrieve my things. The studio smelled like stale air and burnt coffee. The once white walls were scuffed with fingerprints from panic. Vanessa was there, her makeup half done, hair pulled into a bun that screamed exhaustion. She looked up as I entered. "You're really doing this?" she said, almost impressed. "I'm finishing it," I replied. She nodded toward Ethan's closed office. "He's inside. You might want to give him a minute." "No," I said. "He's had months." I walked past her, opened the door. Ethan stood over a desk littered with unpaid bills. The man who once curated perfection now looked like a ruin in designer clothes. "Bella, listen," I cut him off. "You used my name to buy your dreams. You used my silence to build your lies. You built an empire on borrowed trust, and the loan's due." He opened his mouth, but the words failed. I took my folder from the cabinet, the one I'd labeled Foundations. Inside were contracts, invoices, receipts, all the stones of his collapse. "I don't want to destroy you," I said, "but I won't protect you either." I left before he could answer. The downfall wasn't cinematic, it was procedural. But sometimes bureaucracy is the most merciless villain of all. The IRS launched a small-scale audit that uncovered months of misfiled expenses. The investor filed a lawsuit. Clients pulled out. Vendors blacklisted him. The studio shut down within 6 weeks. The name, Cole and Gray, disappeared from every search engine, replaced by Trent Studio. When the journalist who'd followed the story published the final piece, the headline read, "From Visionary to Vanished, the Cost of Creative Deception." Ethan's name trended for all the wrong reasons, and mine, finally, began to surface for the right ones. People assume revenge feels like fireworks, loud, cathartic, brilliant, but mine felt like rain on glass, cold, cleansing, endless. There was a night, maybe a month after the story broke, when I sat on my apartment balcony watching thunder roll over the city. For the first time, I felt the weight leave my chest. I whispered, "It's over." But it wasn't. Not yet. Because revenge ends when peace begins. And peace requires rebuilding. I threw myself into Trent Studio with the same precision I'd once given Ethan's empire. I hired 3 people. Women I'd met in the industry who'd been overlooked, underpaid, or burned by manipulative bosses. Together, we built something clean. We took contracts no one else wanted, small ethical brands, environmental nonprofits, artisan markets. Our motto was simple: integrity scales. I worked 12-hour days, but it wasn't burnout, it was rebirth. By the end of the first year, we doubled revenue and gained international recognition for transparency in creative practice. But I didn't measure success in money anymore. I measured it in calm mornings, in emails I didn't dread, in names I could trust, in invoices that always balanced. Ethan, meanwhile, became a ghost in the local scene. He tried freelancing, consulting, even a rebrand under his initials, but his name was already collateral damage. One afternoon, an intern showed me a post on social media he'd written. Everyone deserves a second chance. Mistakes don't define us. The comments were brutal. People don't forgive liars who never admit they lied. I didn't comment, I didn't gloat, because revenge doesn't need applause. 2 years passed before I saw him again. It was at a design summit in Phoenix. I was on stage giving a talk about ethical storytelling and branding. My presentation ended to quiet applause. When I stepped down, I saw him in the crowd, thinner, paler, eyes sunken, but still carrying that old arrogance trying to masquerade as charm. He waited near the exit, hands stuffed in his pockets. "Bella," he said, "you look good." So do consequences," I replied. He laughed bitterly. "You ruined me." I tilted my head. "No, you did that. I just stopped cushioning the fall." He looked like he wanted to argue, but he didn't. He just nodded once and walked away, swallowed by the crowd. I never saw him again. That night in my hotel room, I couldn't sleep. Not because of him, but because I realized the story was finally over. The chapter wasn't vengeance anymore. It was after. I wrote in my journal, "Peace feels like a room with one chair, one lamp, and no ghosts." I smiled, closed the notebook, and slept like I hadn't in years. A few months later, something unexpected happened. A letter from a woman named Marissa Vega, a small business owner in Chicago. She wrote, "I read about your story. I had an Ethan too. Different name, same script. I didn't think I could start over, but your article made me try. Thank you." That one message was worth every sleepless night, every spreadsheet, every legal email, because my revenge had evolved into something bigger, a warning, a blueprint, a mirror for others to find themselves before it was too late. When Trent's studio turned 3, my team threw a small party at our office. Fairy lights, old jazz on the speakers, laughter bouncing off clean white walls miles. The patient, quiet designer who had joined me early handed me a small box. Inside was a pendant shaped like a compass. "Because you always know your direction," he said. I smiled. "No," I whispered, "because I finally built it." That night, when everyone left, I stood alone in the studio, surrounded by the hum of computers and the faint echo of voices, and I whispered a quiet prayer of gratitude. For the ruin that taught me structure, for the betrayal that taught me boundaries, for the silence that taught me peace. The following year, Trent Studio was featured in Forbes Women in Business under the headline, "How a Creative Director Turned Betrayal into Blueprint." The interviewer asked, "What's your biggest lesson?" I said, "That peace is profitable, that integrity compounds, and that revenge, done right, builds more than it burns." One evening, after a conference, I walked by a bookstore window and stopped. There, in the reflection, I saw myself, calm, self-contained, confident. Behind me, a poster caught my eye. It read, "Healing is not forgetting, it's redesign." I smiled because that's exactly what I'd done. It's been 5 years now. I live in a small modern house with wide windows and no secrets. Miles and I work side by side. Some mornings, he still catches me lost in thought, and I tell him I'm just grateful. Sometimes I think about Ethan, not with anger, but with neutrality, like remembering a closed file. His name pops up once in a while on small freelance boards. He's rebuilding, perhaps. I hope he learned something. but his lessons are no longer my responsibility. So if you're still here, still listening, maybe with your heart cracked open by someone who smiled while dismantling your trust, hear this: you can rebuild. You can start over without bitterness and still win. You can let karma have its courtroom while you build your empire. You can forgive yourself without absolving them, because revenge, at its best, isn't destruction. It's design. It's reclaiming authorship of your own story. And when the final page turns, peace isn't loud. It's just you breathing. This was Revenge Stories with Michelle, where endings don't fade to black, they open to light. If this story spoke to you, like, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from. Your voice matters here. Your story matters too. And remember, the best revenge is to live a life they'll never be invited back into. If you are listening to this late at night with a mug in your hands, know this: you can plan your rescue. You can choose the soil in which you plant the next phase of your life. You can choose walls with locks and windows with light. You can decide what counts as currency and what does not. This was my path. I did not shout. I mapped. I proved. I reclaimed. Then I loved again, carefully, and the life I built after the betrayal was the quietest, truest victory.